So again, good evening and thank you all for being present for this event. I was really excited when Ben first approached me with this last year to be physically present in this sacred space that I consider to be home, which is New Orleans. Because New Orleans is the place that my ancestors are speaking, and there's that spiritual connection for me. Of course, in this time of a global pandemic, we should love our neighbor and care for one another and connect in new and different ways. So before we begin, I'd like to first set the tone as to the whys of this particular topic. That is, people of African descent in the diaspora in the United States are facing the crisis of the breakdown of civil and human rights, while also confronting the inconsistencies and ideologies of Christianity. This is because American Christianity has failed as being an advocate for people of African descent in their struggle towards sustainability and acceptance, and has deterred the furthering of these causes toward equality and liberation throughout U.S. history. In addition, the decline of Christianity over the decades is well documented. People of African descent find themselves now in a unique situation. They now have the resources and empowerment to begin healing by using the rituals and processes through the religions of the African diaspora. Due to American religious propaganda, access to these faith traditions have been shrouded in mystery and miseducation. Historically, the involvement into these traditions were reduced through marginalization as tools toward assimilation into white culture. In other words, something has shifted or has been erupting for at least over 10 years to where, with no one else to turn, with what we thought were those safe spaces, that mask has been removed so that we see the ugly truth without all of the filters. And then we, as the people of the African diaspora, are now reclaiming our time. Having said that, I also want to establish a covenant with all of you all here tonight. My faith and spiritual journey is complicated. It involves rooted in clear affirmations that the Creator is still present and loves, that my ancestors are mobilizing and empowering us toward liberation and speak to us through the drums, and that spirit or spirits or the Holy Spirit are lovingly guiding us back toward the practices, the healing practices that have the potential to begin to brush away, minimize the racial trauma and oppression for over 500 years. Now, maybe you are here because you are curious about what it means to have this dual identity of faith. But the only thing that I really ask is that you respect and have an open mind. When we are called to love one another, that means regardless. When we say we love one another and are open to being in community with each other, that means we also welcome the ways in which we are sojourning, traveling down faith and spiritual pathways. So I hope in this conversation we hear one another and let that root ourselves and ground us in this conversation tonight. Maybe you're here because you are seeking answers, or maybe you're perplexed that a Lutheran pastor would entertain any of this. But please know, I'm a woman of African diaspora before I'm recognized as anything else, because it is my culture and my heritage that defines me, and it is my people and my community that will always have my back. Always. What does it mean to prescribe to a dualistic faith? Does it mean that one is turning away from God? No. God is God. Creator is creator. Creator is not Christian or Jewish or any one definition. God is God, and God speaks to us in many different and beautiful ways, and all these ways are valid, whether it's Judeo-Christian, ancient, or indigenous. Ache. And so I have a little bit of an interlude to play for all of you all as we begin this conversation.
And Africa is in my hair, and in my feet, in my body. I'm African woman. All that we have is the music. The pyramid is the greatest house on planet Earth. Our ancestors are great. God was also female, not only male, right? It's the best thing to be is a singer.
Yes.
And
Music can indeed set the tone and speak both truth and tell the story. Les Nubians' interlude on their first release affirms what they have always known and what should always be a part of the normal narrative, that our ancestors are indeed great, that Africa remains within our physical bodies, carried in our DNA, and that we identify as first and foremost with Africa. And shockingly, that the Creator can be both, whether that's male or female or even non-binary, or even that there are, besides the Creator, other divinities or deities. Let me pause there for a second, because when we begin to speak of anything but the Christian identity of how we perceive God, we assume that it's malevolent, evil, and quite frankly, of the devil. But I want you all to think about in Genesis, where it clearly talks about the Creator was speaking to the heavenly council. And the Creator says this, "Now let us conceive a new creation, humanity made in our image, fashioned according to our likeness." If both the angels and ourselves as humanity are what God created and birthed out of God's love, exactly who is this heavenly council? Who is God actually speaking to? Melanoma Some says this, "Western civilization is suffering from a great sickness of the soul." And this is such a beginning and powerful quote by Melanoma Some, and this is just one of the many statements that are woven throughout our time together that sets the tone for the evening. And if you all hear motorcycle noise, by the way, I apologize. It's warm in here in Buffalo, and I drive up and down the street. So sorry about that. So as Ben says, my name is the Reverend Kwame Pitts, and I am a woman of the African diaspora. I was named for the first president of Ghana, Kwame NKrumah, and therefore it is my responsibility to continue to push towards freedom and liberation from a society that dominates with oppression, systemic racism, and legalized violence. Where do I find my empowerment and encouragement then beyond the philosophical thinking to do this justice work? During the first wave of the civil rights movement, the church and faith communities is where people found solidarity and hope. Justice was fought for, regardless of who you were marching beside. Now, when you mention Black Lives Matter, your pain and lamenting is met with threats and mocking of one's humanity. I'm a called and ordained pastor in the wider breadth of the ELCA. And throughout my life, Christianity was all I was aware of, and was the faith tradition of my mothers and my elders in my extended family. But as I answer the call from the Creator about this path and the journey that the Creator has set me on, what I witnessed and experienced was a Christianity that was addicted to the empire and all the empire's false promises. This is what Melanoma Some, a well-known African writer, a theologian, an elder, and a shaman in the Gara tribe, points into his various works surrounding ritual and respecting the divine harmony that the Creator places before Creator as a duty to mirror. His further assessment is as follows, quote, "The West's progressive turning away from functioning spiritual values, its total disregard for the environment and the protection of natural resources, the violence of urban cities with their problems of poverty, drugs, and crime, spiraling unemployment, and economic disarray, and growing intolerance towards people of culture and language and immigration status, All of these trends will bring down self-destruction. So the US has had amnesia about racism, white nationalism, and white supremacy. So play nice Christianity and how we got here. American Christianity has become the moral default for the culture here in America, equating what makes a good US citizen with being a good Christian. To avoid the stigma of being an outcast in American society, citizens are expected to assimilate into a homogeneous identity. That means enforcing dogmas about submitting to the masters that God ordained, even biblically when one's origins were in question. Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas uses historian Forrest G. Wood's estimation about the system and Christianity's involvement to make this point. She states, quote, "It is inherent in every monotheistic faith that there are only truth and error, good and evil. Since the dark-skinned heathen obviously did not belong on the side of truth and good, the Christian assigned him to terror and evil." So there's this caveat to the promises made and etched on the Statue of Liberty at Ellis Island that was incorporated into the racism and oppression that would ensue. Religion conspiring with this new empire, working together to keep the draconian order so that real power will be limited to a defined facet of society. It is interesting to note that in the search for freedom and civil and religious rights, those white European refugees in search of a new land exerted the same oppressive and even power on the natives, and subsequently the enslaved. It is also interesting that there was nothing in Christianity's dogma or doctrine that instructed them, as Kelly Brown Douglas points out, not to support the, quote, "violent denigration of human bodies, especially Black bodies." But even more devastating that the enslavement ensued upon indigenous and African bodies was Christianity's, westernized Christianity in this new country called the United States of America. Their insidious bond, which would evolve into white American culture. Platonized Christianity, added into white supremacist ideology, birthed the religious racism that has infected everything from socioeconomics to politics to the practical aspects of religion and faith. It is no wonder then, when we who hear and feel this call towards pursuing theological education find ourselves at a crossroads when encountering hostility in academia and in seminary, of unhelpful language, skewed principles, and oppressive theories that created a biased and prejudiced educational theological space when Black bodies are introduced. For that matter, any bodies that were not cisgendered, white, and male, the perceived normality for higher education. Those of the diaspora then would be questioned when we challenge the academic status quo about where our stories, our truth, and our theologians. What theological thought would empower practical action in our churches, our neighborhoods, and the streets? What rituals in the church could we place into action, steeped in theological roots, when it came time for us to be present and active in our own liberation? Where I have found affirmation is rooted in both Black liberation theology and womanist theology. The reason behind this is because there are theologies rooted in the culture and the heritage of African descent and the African diaspora. These theologies assert and rooted in the practical knowledge that has been with our people and in our DNA. And what Kelly Brown Douglas conveys that, quote, "according to the African theological consciousness, everything is connected to the great high God. Therefore, everything is sacred." Furthermore, because of much Black culture began to splinter after the first civil rights movement over whether Christianity could or should be implemented to mend the fractures or healing, or whether this birth of freedom Black people could now embrace all of their culture, including every aspect of religion and faith. But Christianity in the hands of those in power did not live into the commandment of loving our neighbors as ourselves. Christianity became a tool of oppression and subjugation with regards to Black bodies. Quote, when Negro slaves were first brought to the British colonies in America, they were not baptized, as there was some doubt as to whether they were capable of receiving baptism. When it was finally decided that a Negro was really a human being capable of being baptized, a new hindrance to the conferring of the sacrament was discovered, namely, that baptism might free the slave. The general prevailing idea that it could. This is a condemning statement from Brother Philip Neri in the article Baptism and Freedom of the Negro Slaves in the Early Colonial Period. In other words, baptism, a rite of the church, a ritual of the church, something that we hold very dear and sacred, was weaponized during the transatlantic slave trade against Black and African bodies. Baptism is supposed to be a rite, a welcoming ritual, where a sibling of faith and love in Christ is seen as an equal, not to then be dehumanized as 3/5 of a person. So here's my question. What will have been the impact in that time of healing and empowerment if African Americans were able to embrace their indigenous spirituality and use rituals in vacating the trauma of systemic racism and legal violence? Melanoma Some says, we need ritual because it is an expression of the fact that we recognize the difficulty of creating a different and special kind of community. A community that does not have ritual cannot exist. A corporate community is not a community. That's a conglomeration of individuals in the service of an insatiable, soulless entity. And so, as we often say, many folks of the African diaspora walk like we have 3,000 ancestors behind us. So I'd like to share with you a ritual that is done a lot in many African American churches, many places where African Americans or those of the African diaspora gather. I actually did this ritual a couple of weeks ago for another conference, but I thought it'd be appropriate because not many people see the rite of libations a lot. And it's just something very important. So for those of you all who are watching, this is my take on the ritual of libations. And actually behind me, as you'll see here in the clip, is my actual ancestral altar. I'm the Reverend Kwame Pitts, and welcome to Libations. As a called and ordained minister in the Christian tradition, rituals, rites, and other ways that communities come together are very important. But as a woman of the African diaspora in the States, none are more important to me than the rite of libations. The reason why African Americans in this country have begun to incorporate this into our daily lives is that our ancestors, when they were enslaved, were robbed of all of the traditions, the cultures, the rites, the rituals, the language, the community. And so therefore, as African Americans, we have had to create a culture here. But we also want to honor the culture that we know that we have come from. The rite of libations is important because for me, this is where I begin my day. I begin my day at my ancestral altar, which is behind me. They're filled with faces of people that have been instrumental in my life. From my mother-in-law, to my grandmother, to all of my grandfather's siblings. Ancestors are still speaking. And so when we begin a new journey, when we begin some important ceremony, when we're celebrating a part of life, we want to invite down the ancestors into the space. And so we do so. We first acknowledge the Creator who has many names, from Great Spirit, a grandfather, God, Jehovah, Odumare, many names of God. We know that God is always present, that God walks with us, that we were born of stardust, that we come from the cosmos, that God's breath breathes in our bodies, and the holy fire is what empowers us and encourages us to do the work that we are called to do. In the acknowledgement of the Creator who we worship, we say, Ache. And because of the Creator, we were birthed or born into communities or families, whether chosen or blood related, or heritage or lineage. We were born into places where we are loved and beloved. And we continue the work that our ancestors, those that have been known to us, those grandparents, great-grandparents, those aunts, those uncles, even when we have younger members of our community who go from being those children to ancestors, we acknowledge them. We know they're still speaking, that they're playing the drums that empower our hearts, that reverberate within our souls. And for those ancestors that are known, we say, Ache. But we also pour libations for those ancestors we do not know. Those that have been fighting for many, many decades, or even a millennia, whose names are synonymous with human rights, civil rights, liberation, freedom. People like Malcolm X and John Lewis. People like Breonna Taylor and Trayvon Martin and Sandra Bland. People like Rosa Parks. There's so many names to name. People that we don't know. People that stood for something. People who were, whether they were average, and we got to know their story because something horrific, or they were out there doing that work, and we learned about them in history. We learned about in storytelling, encounters that maybe our elders had with them. So for those ancestors that we did not know, but made an impact on this world, we name them and we say, Ache. We pour libations for those ancestors that we will never know, that are still there speaking beyond the crossroads, that are standing beyond the crossroads, continuing to empower us, to remind us of the responsibility that we have to continue this fight. Those ancient tribal ancestors, those places that we may never get a chance to visit, but we know that we belong to them, and they belong to us. And we're thankful for what they did, whether they fought for freedom on slave ships, or whether they fought when they got here, like Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth. We acknowledge their presence and we say, Ache. We also pour libations for all of those who have been victims of police brutality, white supremacy, white nationalism, racism, and oppression. For all of those who have fought to just be vital in this community, in your community, all over the world. We pour out libations for those who have been victims of human rights trafficking and human rights injustice in many different places. We pour out libations for those who really are freedom fighters, and we say, Ache. We pour out libations for those who are not maybe perhaps of the African diaspora, but who are many communities of culture and of language, who continue the fight, our Native and First Nation siblings, and those across the globe, Indigenous and Aboriginal, who continue to be a presence, whose rituals and whose tongue and whose language and whose wisdom and whose acknowledgement, whose stories are important, who have taught us more about grace than we've ever learned in any doctrine or in any academic setting,
We pour libations for those who are still fighting for their ancestors to continue to be vital, that their stories is just as important as ours, who are still fighting for their land, the rights to water, the rights to practice whatever spiritual tradition, whatever religion that they and their ancestors have always practiced, the right to be who they are and whom they love. And we say Ache. Finally, we pour libation for ourselves, for those who are working so very hard here and now, for those who are working for educational justice, against environmental racism, those who are battling food injustice and disparity, those who are fighting for those who are mass incarcerated and fighting for their freedom, for restitution and reconciliation, those who are fighting that we can love who we want, live how we want, those who are fighting for the environment to be a better place, for all to have access to equity and equality. We pour this for ourselves because self-care is so important. And we say Ache. I hope this rite of libation carries you throughout the day, through all that you will be doing today. I hope you remember to do this in your homes, maybe weekly as a practice, to come before the place where you come to greet your own ancestors, or where you do your devotions, or where you start your day, whether it's in a garden or inside, whether it's in your own private room, your library, or outdoors, in the forest, by the rivers, by seas. I hope you will remember to pour libations for those who have come before you, those who have impacted your life, those like many people here at my ancestral altar, where I know that they are still speaking. And it's because of them that I know that I am loved. But more so because I know that I am loved because the Creator put me in contact with Him. And the Creator is still speaking, and the Creator does love. And the Creator gets angry when we get angry because we are fighting for justice. And the Creator stands with the oppressed. So on this day, I say to you, Ache and blessings. Peace.
One of the biggest examples of using ritual as a way towards revolution is the Haitian Revolution. The God who created the earth, who created the sun that gives us light, the God who holds up the ocean, who makes the thunder roar, our God who has ears to hear, you who are hidden in the clouds, who watch us from where you are. You see all that the white has made us suffer. The white man gods ask him to commit crimes, but the God within us wants us to do good. Our God, who is so good, so just, he orders us to revenge our wrongs. It is he who will direct our arms and bring us victory. It is he who will assist us. We should throw away the image of the white man's God who is so pitiless. Listen to the voice for liberty that speaks in all our hearts. These were words that were rumored to be spoken at those gathered in the deepest sacred part of Haiti at Boscommon. Engaging in ritualized action, usually through some liturgy of prayers, recognition of confession, or invitation to the table, encourages community healing, affirmation, and comfort. The conception that ritual action from a faith aspect would cause people in turn to be enraged instead of complacent and merely suffer in silence bothers most people. The background for this revolution and ceremony that occurred in August of 1791 occurred because enslavement by the occupying French, Haitians were angered that their lives and the humanity were ignored and abused for Napoleon's financial and economic gain. Further humiliation increased as access to their economic livelihood had been eliminated and their lands appropriated. Families and whole communities would be separated to work in many of the land on the French plantations in often brutal conditions. Finally, their spirituality and their faith traditions were banned and demonized. The Haitian people were, to say the least, tired of the worsening conditions. In their outrage, several hundred Haitian slaves gathered at Boscommon in the northern mountains, not only to lament and to grieve collectively as a community, but also to plan action. For Haitians then, this meant leaning on the one resource that they still had access to, even if it was in secret, their indigenous faith. I'd like to play a clip from you for you all. This is from Haiti, and this is about sort of the economic and social political revolution and the spiritual revolution about what happened that night.
Parole coulée dans grec, pas vaccine ni fait blanc, pour doubler sommeil blanc. L'ennui de fond dans poney, parole coulée dans grec, c'est complot liberté, pourquoi paix méchanceté? Songez beaucoup la Fatima, songez ça fait bataillement, c'est nous qui créons liberté. Accent cap couri, l'enfant n'am cap souffri, l'ennui de son enfant nèg, j'autre ouais l'esprit nèg mec, pour qu'on voit caïman, mais flamme désagrément. Songez beaucoup la Fatima, songez ça fait pas caïman, c'est nous qui créons liberté, nous baissons ça. Hypote non Haïti, côté Babio Soti, l'ennui de fond dans Poney, l'enfant d'un coup mentec, l'homme sans vinagrage, nous craser l'esclavage. Songez beaucoup la Fatima, beaucoup la Fatima. fait bagaillement. C'est nous qui créons liberté. Au chant, au chant bagaillement. Au chant bookman. Au chant bagaillement. Liberté ou la mort. Abat l'esclavage. Pourquoi la bâtiment? Songez à faire bagaillement. C'est nous qui créons liberté. Osha Bookman. Osha Wakaima. C'est dans Wakaima. Liberté pour tout le monde sur la terre. Commencez.
Those that were gathered for this time of liberation, who were calling out the Creator as only they knew the Creator to be, began this ritual that lasted 4 days. It is rumored and it is told in story that they invited one of the most powerful Lawas or spirits in the Haitian voodoo pantheon. Her name is Zulidantor. Zulidantor, and that ritual became the catalyst for liberation. Zulidantor is recognized as the mother of all Haitians and the main warrior spirit of the country. She wields silver daggers and swords. She will go into battle and defend her people without question and with an unyielding vengeance and rage. What was said or what actual rite was performed during this days-long ritual is lost to history. But there is an agreement that the political independence gained is attributed to this particular ceremony. This indigenous faith and religious faith did not instruct its followers to be humble and submit to the will of their masters. It emboldened the people and affirmed that not only was this occupation a violation of their human rights, it also upended the harmonious order that had been taught and passed down to them through stories, through songs, and through rituals. In order, however, for the traditions of African ancestors to survive, for those not lucky enough to empower their own freedom, they had to compromise to continue to teach future generations that these spiritual traditions were valid and therefore use the religious symbols of those of the oppressors as another way to live out their faith. So what does ritual mean now? Going back to Some, he says, ritual is called for because our soul communicates the things to us that the body translates as need, want, or absence. So we enter into ritual in order to respond to the call of the soul. And as we have been taught, those of us who have been absorbed in the faith of our fathers and grandmothers have been searching for that balm in Christianity to soothe us in this pain. We have also been trying to create rituals from prayers and from the creed and from hymns, because clearly we hear in the Gospels that God indeed stands with the oppressed, that Jesus Christ stands in the middle of the oppressed, and yet we're inundated with false narratives and bad theology that comes directly as a result of the empire riding that Trojan horse into our churches. Peoples of many diasporas are leaving Christianity for their own safety and mental health. I began seriously researching this about 6 or 7 years ago, as my own questions resurfaced from a spiritual exploration that began 10 years prior. And with what that has been happening over the past couple of years, I became curious about what are the number of people of African descent who have left the Christian denominations, whether more conservative or liberal. What is the makeup of those who are discerning about where their faith is rooted? And who are using it as a resource for healing and wellness. During the second annual Mystic Soul Conference that was held in the summer of 2019 in Chicago, participants had an opportunity to explore the questions surrounding dual belonging and multi-faith. These questions focused on understanding and wanting to interact with ancestral worship. In a workshop that I facilitated entitled Walking Two Paths, an exploration of the elephant in the room, participants inquired about navigating what the appropriateness of engaging this as a spiritual practice with regards to both people of color and non-people of color. Many of the participants also wanted to be educated on indigenous faith practices, especially as if with most African Americans based on family history, they've been rooted firmly in Christianity, as well as how to become interfaith allies with communities of indigenous faiths. It is clear, even through music and social media, these mysteries or unknown faiths are becoming more prevalent. Not having equal access or affirmation to practices of indigenous faiths such as Voodoo, Ifa, Santeria, and others for people of African descent in the US has contributed to the deficiency and the stalling of an entirety of a culture and a people who remain in exile. Racism manifests in many different ways: the acts of enslavement, racist socioeconomics, oppressive public policies, and governmental laws. But the way people recover from such trauma is often through some manifestation of faith. For many African descendants, the faith of our fathers has been Christianity, but there has not been a return on the investment that many African Americans have poured into Christianity. At times, the church has rejected and participated in the destruction of the Black body. So this then begs the question, why hasn't there been practical, theological, and praxis around the creation of rituals toward healing for those who have been a victim of the system? Why have the writings of the Christian mystics, whose focus was towards the healing of one body in correlation with connecting to God, not been taken more seriously instead of being recognized only in the abstract? Indigenous ancient spirituality has always been present. The pictures before you are some that were taken last year in the park. Actually, no, it was taken this year. I corrected. Earlier this year was taken in a park right after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. These are people who practice many ancient and indigenous faiths, who gathered together for a time of public healing and with the racial trauma that had been happening. In one of these pictures I have is a picture of my beloved God sis and dear friend Sandra. Sandra wrote and contributed to an article about being a bruja as a revolution. She writes, quote, "Within the past few years, a movement has developed where many people of color are reshaping their perception of what it means to be a brujo or bruja and acknowledge the brujera's powerful legacy. This affirmation of the term is a rediscovery and a homecoming of sorts, in the ability to find power in the wisdom, spiritual wisdom of their ancestors. The renewed interest in brujeria can be linked to the rise of modern feminism and the historical exclusion of women of color within this movement. The idea of la bruja aligns more with the womanist movement than mainstream feminism. Womanism focusing more on the lives and stories of women of color, especially Black women. According to the scholar Lade Marapan, womanism seeks to, quote, restore the balance between people and the environment and nature and reconcile human life with the spiritual dimension, end quote. Being a womanist means that you are fighting for the whole of the community that we are dedicated to and our humanity. But being a womanist, I feel, also opens it up to the divine and allows us to be spiritually fluid, to where we are working our way back towards those rites and rituals that are healing and that affirms our humanity and our righteous rage, to push back against the disharmony. Being a womanist means also in times of crisis, uncertainty, and lamenting, we lean back on those rituals taught to us by our mothers or grandmothers or aunts. The ways in which we lean back upon nature, those rituals and ways when there are snapshots of what our ancestors did so long ago of curing and healing and of protection. of ways in which we continue to connect with those long ago, but who we're still teaching. Through stories, knowledge is passed. Through music, teaching happens. The repetition, we're more secure in that we're working with nature. We're safeguarding not only ourselves, but our community. That's why even today, there are many of us who identify as womanists in some way, shape, or form that also do incorporate these ancient ways into our life, because that is the way we survive and thrive. It does not define us, but it is a part of us. These alternative forms of ancestral practices are rooted in the empowerment of the marginalized. Indigenous practices are no longer hidden because they help the reclaiming of power. This world of mysticism belongs to those who are so often included from traditional religions that marginalize its parishioners. Practitioners of ancestral spiritualities are symbols of power outside the perimeters of the status quo, where patriarchy or misogyny, homophobia, and transphobia exists. Sandra continues. We also challenge existing social constructs. Engaging in ancestral spiritual practice is an act of decolonizing one's spirit from patriarchal and Western world values. It heals historical trauma. Brujeria and similar traditions reconnect practitioners to the vibrant strength of their ancestry and culture, helping people process the embedded pain created by colonization. This allows for the creation of new historical narratives. In this context, brujeria and other indigenous ancestral practices become revolutionary. Ritual should be normalized, no matter how it manifests. So what does this mean? This means for people of the African diaspora and other cultures and heritage and language, that means that there are rituals that we have not been able to tap into simply because we've been westernized, we've been colonized, we've been called to assimilate and be subjugated. And the rituals that are held in many of these traditions are very healing. In fact, in West African tradition, there is actually only one creator. But because the creator knew that we as human beings, as humanity, would be a little chaotic, as the creator pulled back, but not pulling back the creator's love, the creator then sends in intermediaries. And so in West African tradition, these come in the form of ancestors. These come in the form of the Orisha. These come in the form of Lawa. They come in form in different spirits. They come in the form of angels. All of these given to us because some way, shape, and form, the creator knew we were going to have a really hard time. And in all these traditions, one of the biggest things is about divine harmony. That because of this connection with ancestors, with spirits, with creator, with ourselves, we were to emulate that same divine harmony. So every ritual, every rite, everything that we did was for the community, to protect the community, to heal the community, to be community. Anything that was not harmonious or not emulated this divine harmony was evil. So our rituals today, wherever we are, cannot be weaponized against bodies. Baptism was used against our people before we were put on slave ships. Our ancestors put on slave ships and brought over here. Baptism is freeing someone to be a part of the community, to be recognized that God indeed loves them. But that's not what baptism was used for. And that's a painful beginning. And so here and now today, more and more we have displays, as what I just showed you on the last slide, of indigenous and ancient practices coming together towards healing. One of the biggest displays of indigenous practice was at Standing Rock. If you didn't recognize it, everything they did was ritual. They were leaning back on their faith, their ancestors' practices to heal, to protect. They were making a statement. And it's when those indigenous and ancient practices make those statements to empower people, that is when the empire, the corrupt world, is frightened, scared, and tries to suppress us. Rituals, no matter how we create these rituals on our own, should be a normal part of our life. I am going to stop here, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I would love to hear any one of your thoughts. I would love to hear your comments, all of your questions, because I know there are probably a lot. And I would just love to engage in a time of conversation for as long as we have. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not even going to say anything except to just say something logistics wise, which is that if you have a question and would like to speak, please indicate that in the chat. I think that will facilitate the best way for the questions and answers to happen. You don't have to type it out in the chat, but indicate in the chat if you have a question. Francisco, is that hand raised indicating a question?
Yep, that's me. Does anybody have a question to go before I do?
Go ahead.
So my first question is, Pastor Kwame, I'm certain that you have heard people that are more used to the white Anglo-European perspective of things expressing concern that by using things that aren't tied to white Anglo-Western perspectives are somehow syncretic, or they aren't authentic, or there may be even a corruption of the faith. What is your response to people who bring these concerns that somehow, when they say that because of the practices of the African diaspora are so important to you, it somehow means that your Christianity isn't pure or is somehow corrupt? How do you respond to such critics?
Thank you, Francisco, so much. First and foremost, one of the things that I would definitely respond with that is this. You can't be so worried about how people of the diaspora or other people are trying to survive, thrive, and be empowered. Because as much as people look at these practices and say, well, they're not Christian, and yet they allow racism, oppression, and other things to be a part of our everyday Christian lives in church on Sunday. How can you turn your back on this and allow racism to be a part of your church, white supremacy to be a part of church? How can you worship white supremacy in your church, whether it's in your liturgy, in your prayers, putting the American flag in the midst of your sanctuary when it does not belong, and not following what Jesus calls us to do, which is love our neighbor, period. They may not understand the practices, and I understand that piece because it's been suppressed for so long. But I think the biggest question really needs to be, how can we support our siblings in Christ and faith, no matter how they express or how they are, or what heals them? How can we do that? How can we be those allies, even if we don't extremely understand the whys? And I get that, because it hasn't been taught. It's only been taught one thing, especially in this particular country, that we're a Christian nation. I mean, we have done a lot, not only to natives, but even to our Jewish siblings, our Muslim siblings. We've done all that. So how do we get upset when folks of the African diaspora and other diasporas and native folks, and natives and First Nation folks, continue to celebrate and continue to venerate and continue to do all these things, but you refuse to turn off the racism, the white supremacy, the white ideology that happens in churches, and is more harmful than anything else that we could actually do? So that's how I would answer that question.
Denise, would you like to go?
had to get my cursor on the right side of my screen. Thank you, Pastor Ben. Pastor Kwame, thank you so much for this amazing time and talk. I would just like to make a comment that what I appreciate the most about what's been discussed here this evening is the path to healing for Black women, for womanist theologians, for women of color who have been harmed by all of the things that you just named and by some of the things implicit in Francisco Herrera's question. It is rare for me as a Lutheran woman, a Black Lutheran woman, to talk about healing that is specific to my situation and to my soul in the Lutheran space. And Lutheran space must begin to allow for that conversation and for that expression of pain and for the ways and rituals of healing that are inherent to us. So Pastor Kwame, the fact that you are able to bring this to us in this setting is just phenomenal, just phenomenal. And I thank you so much.
Thank you, Denise. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Danny, would you like to go next? And if other people have questions, please note in the chat that you would like to speak.
Good evening. I'm grateful to be here and to have heard of Reverend Kwame speak. She is a sister, and I'm here in Buffalo, and she was absolutely wonderful. And my question is, so for ancestrally, I so appreciate you speaking about the ancestors and the many ways that you have this dual spirituality. And my question to you is, for people who identify as Christian and who also identify and recognize that they are part of the African diaspora, what are some ways of helping people to kind of allow for the coming together and for there to be some more of like a seamless understanding of how Christianity through colonization, like that process helped us to make it to where we are today, but that we can still embrace the Orishas and embrace who we were long before we were captured. Because I've been reading about how, which I so appreciate you making space for, like the Orishas, because like I've been reading that like Yemaya, like literally traveled with us from West Africa to the Americas and stayed with us and made sure that we were okay. So for these precious spirits to have always watched over us and then to almost deny them now that we have this concept of Christianity, like how do we help people to kind of like make space for both and be able to allow them to mesh?
Thank you, Danny, so much. I want people to realize here that I know and understand that being immersed in Christianity may be the place where God has called you. That's your path. And you're rooted in it. And that's absolutely beautiful. I think there's so many different expressions about how we connect to the Creator. And I think for those of us in the African diaspora who are very rooted and have found that comfort in Christianity and been able to balance a lot of the things, having an ancestor altar just as a practical sense is like one of the biggest ways to connect with ancestors. We venerate our ancestors. We worship God. Let me be clear. We venerate ancestors. We venerate Orisha. We venerate Lawa, but we only worship Creator. Creator is where we have all come from. No matter who we are or how we love or how we identify, it is the Creator who has made the entire cosmos and birthed us from stardust. And so like, I think for us to have an understanding, to do our reading, to appreciate it, to mark it as history, to say how beautiful and how wonderful that, although history has said, and started with the curse of Cain, that Africans and African bodies were savage and heathen and stuff like that. Look at the width and breadth of our spirituality that happened even way before. Like we have that history. There's so much to learn. And so we can recognize and see, wow, our ancestors, regardless of what history tries to tell us, or the history books, how they've been written, we really were an engaged people. We really were connected to God. We really had an entire pantheon. We mostly talk about Greeks and Romans and stuff like that, that they have this pantheon, but we have a huge pantheon. And not only is it just ancient, but it's also now, because these practices are going on now. So again, being a Christian and recognizing that just because you learn about these things, even if you are firmly rooted in your Christianity, doesn't lessen your connection with God. I think those are places where God is speaking. Like, we have to remember our ancestors and some of the things that they have done and the ways they empowered themselves through all sorts of things. And once we recognize that, that's just empowerment. It really is empowerment. So it's history. It's just ways for us to be like, wow, we have really contributed a lot. So I think those are some of the ways I think that those who identify as Christians, who are rooted in their Christianity, who continue to fight and will continue to be that presence. And I think for me, the reason why people of culture and language of the diaspora are in Christianity, because we are the ways where we can turn the mirror on our non-POC siblings and say, look, you have damaged an entire nation. And if you are still complicit with this part of Christianity will fail. But God will always still be present. The gospel is still speaking, and you're not listening to Jesus. You're not following Jesus. That is why I think we are still in Christianity, still fighting. So thank you, Danny.
Thank you so much.
Who else has a thought or a question or an idea? Feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead.
Okay, I put this in the chat. This is Betty from Spokane. I'm going to have kind of two thoughts. One is that I agree. Baptism has been used against African people. But if we understand what baptism does, baptism incorporates us into the one body of Christ. Then how in the world can I enslave? How can I treat my brother and sister in Christ the way that the white Christian community has treated African American and other people of color? It is going against what we say we believe, and we need to wrestle as white people as white Christians. We need to wrestle with that. And then secondly, just kind of, on the question of, are we incorporating pagan practices into Christianity or whatever? Every time you put up a Christmas tree, you are incorporating German pagan practices into your faith practice. So, in a sense, I don't see what the big deal is. So those are kind of my two comments. But I really, I'm trying to think, Thomas, I think it's Thomas Hargrove Wilson, talks about the fact that in early Virginia, in Virginia colony, that the slaves would be upstairs and the white planters would be downstairs, but they would all go to the same altar, and nobody, it was white theologians that put the theology in place so you could ignore what was going on at that table, what God was doing at that table. We need to come to grips with how our theology has failed us and failed people of color.
Thank you, Betty, so much for that. Definitely, I think one of the reasons why baptism was allowed to do that, because they started putting those things in place. There's a lot of work that Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas has done around Thomas Jefferson, and the fact that Thomas Jefferson was known to be very God-fearing, but was also a little freaked out to the fact that if they actually did some of these Christian practices, actually lived as what God called us to do, that means there really couldn't be enslavement. Now, could there?
Right.
So Christianity then worked with the empire to make sure that all that meant then that when my ancestors were enslaved and baptized, it just meant you're free when you die, not free when we drag you over here. That's the whole problem. And I think too, I think the other thing is something that you said I was sort of laughing about. Yeah, I mean, Christmas trees, Christmas trees, Easter eggs, there's a lot of things in Christianity we have borrowed from other traditions. And we've normalized and say, well, this is what Christmas is about. I mean, but technically, Advent is a time that we really should be celebrating as Christians. Advent really is our season. Even with Lent and Holy Week, I mean, that really is a sacred time. Pentecost, we regulate Pentecost to one day, and we have a whole season of Pentecost that's in our lectionary. Like literally, Pentecost should be celebrated all that time. It should be read on our altar forever, but we don't do that. And so I think one of the things that I would suggest for non-POC, that we start asking the questions in our faith communities and to our neighbors about that you all talk with your neighbors, your church communities, where you serve, where you are, and start asking those questions. Why is it we're ignoring this part of our theological history? When will we be bold enough to actually start tearing this down? When will we, if we're Lutherans, take that 95 Theses and put it on the walls where white supremacy and racism lives and tell it no more, no longer? When will we be able to do that? Because until that happens, it doesn't matter what we do, there's still going to be white supremacy, racism in this denomination. And clearly, when our presiding bishop has conversations or speaks out for racial justice, for equality, I mean, we just put a whole thing up there 2 weeks ago, we condemn white supremacy. Did you all see all of the comments that were posted on the ELCA's official Facebook page of, unfortunately, I hate to say this, and for those of you all on the Zoom call, white people getting really angry that the fact that we even put that up there. And I was told by several people, don't read the comments. But this is why every day there are people of culture and language in this church, in this denomination, who question every day, why am I still in this church? Why am I in Christianity? I will tell you, starting at least 5 years ago, there are young Black millennials and others beginning to leave Christianity in droves because it's no longer fulfilling. And I think the thing that we need to do, well, you all need to, excuse me, I keep saying we, but I'm specifically going to put this on my white siblings. Y'all have to start pushing back, being bolder. Otherwise, it's never going to end. And I will become an elder in a couple of decades. I will become an elder and have to continue to teach those who are still fighting for liberation. I want this fight for liberation to cease with my generation so that no longer do people have to go through this. I have elders telling me they thought this would be over when the civil rights movement happened. And they're sad and they feel down because this is still happening and they're still having to encourage us. Thank you.
The next person who has a thought or idea is welcome to unmute themselves and go ahead.
This is Linda, near Betty. I live in Spokane Valley in Washington. I recently moved here from serving on one of our Lutheran churches on a native reservation, and I just want to commend all my brothers and sisters of color for taking us, the white people, on to teach us. I pray for your strength. I pray for your endurance as you continue to commit to try to teach us to be better Christians. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Mary Beth Hoffman from Milwaukee,
Yes.
Wisconsin. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for speaking your truth. And as I'm doing this, I'm trying to get my video up, and apparently I can't do two things at once. Okay. Thank you for speaking your truth. And I've been working on myself for several years, and the work of being anti-racist. And one thing that I want to say just to the woman who just spoke, you know, it's wonderful that you have people who are taking the time to teach you and educate you. But as a white person, we have a responsibility to, people of color are not, it isn't their responsibility to teach us of what we're doing wrong. And my cat talks when I start talking, so I apologize for that. But it's just very, it's a struggle, you know, because I think everybody's at different phases in their journey. And I'm speaking of white people, you know, in my work, on the synodical level. And I've learned to just talk less, listen more, and I get educated by other means, and I do the work of, you know, when things come up, I with other people of white, you know, I try to help them along on their journey. And I don't know, it's a struggle. I mean, but I'm committed. And I also know that it's, you know, I have that white privilege of being able to, you know, kind of walk away from it if it gets too hard. But, you know, people of color don't have that privilege. And I don't know, I'm kind of rambling right now, but I wanted to just point out that, you know, as grateful as that the woman who spoke before me, you know, it's wonderful that you do have people to help you and walk with you, but also, you know, we need to do our own work and look internally. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your comment.
Pastor Kwame, I'll ask a question.
I think I see someone's trying to talk, but we can't hear you too well if you are trying to. So if you want to talk, just unmute and go for it.
Are you able to hear me?
No, unfortunately, you sound really, really far away.
Okay. I will stop trying. Thank you so much.
There we go. We can hear you now, at least a little bit, Anna. So go ahead. We'll do our best.
Perhaps if I hold the phone directly to my face, how is that doing?
All right, let's go for it.
Okay, is this any better? I want to say thank you. And how about I turn off my video? Maybe that will help the power of the voice. I figured out the problem.
I'm sorry, we're on a Bluetooth speaker. That's the problem. I bet you can hear me really well now.
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
I am so sorry for having you on Bluetooth. Kwame, I was trying to say thank you and ask about whether you've known of a congregation to set up an ancestral altar, and whether that would work, or whether you would recommend that, and how a congregation might go about doing so. That was all. Thanks for trying so hard to hear me.
So there's already a tradition for Christian churches about All Saints Day. And I think for All Saints Day that's celebrated, there's a way that you can set up a table, put pictures, like candles. And I think that's a communal way to come together to remember your those who have been influential or important to you in your life and your walk. And I'm talking specifically right now to non-POC. I think those are some really good ways, and leaving that up throughout the year. And maybe as the year starts, if people unfortunately get added, you can actually, just add people to it and then remember them. Do something in their honor and their memory. I think that's the important thing. That you could, do a food drive or do something, because it's around meal and around food. A lot of communities of culture and language do a lot of stuff around food when they're remembering ancestors. So for example, in Haiti, it's Fête Guédé. Fête Guédé is November 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. So that is the difference from the Day of the Dead, which is celebrated by our Latinx, etc. folks. They celebrate that. So that's something different, because they go into the cemetery, they have a huge party, they remember. There's all these things that happen. So I think for congregations, you can do that as a communal way of coming together. However, revering your ancestors, venerating your ancestors really is something that you can do in your own personal space. It's really, for folks of the African diaspora and for other cultures, it really is a time when we come to them, to that space. And as you saw in the video that I did, that is my ancestor altar in my home. And that is the place I begin to end my day. It's my personal time with my ancestors to be empowered, to hear some of the messages that they are speaking, and then to be able to go out and be empowered to remember the reasons why I do the work that I do. That's kind of the importance for an ancestor altar. It's for that empowerment, to remember, to know that you're loved, you know that there's responsibility. We stand on the shoulders of our ancestors. So for us in the African diaspora and for others, this is the importance. We continue their work. When I preach sermons, especially around funerals, I tell people, now is the time. The way you can honor those who have gone before you is to continue to do that work that you're called to do. So I mean, a communal altar of remembering, all the saints in your church is great on All Saints Day. But an ancestral altar is something very serious, and not everybody is going to want to do that. It holds a deeper meaning I think for us in the African diaspora. And so, like, again, a communal space to remember people, and to then be able to turn that into, it's not just a time where we're going to come here and do this. Like, if you're going to put a communal space where you remember those who are important in your life, then also make that space to be like, okay, so after church on Sunday, we're going to go this. That's why we're doing it. Every day that I'm at my ancestral altar and I go out, I'm going out because I know my grandmother is still cheering me on. My grandmother was a huge and beloved and dedicated Christian woman. I love her. She's lived here 94 years. And I know when I go out and I'm preaching in my church or I'm doing some work, it's because I know she is still cheering me on. But like I said, again, it's also sacred time. So it just really depends. It's not something you can just build and say, here we have it. It's too sacred. It's too serious. But again, like All Saints Day, turn it into a weekend where you're doing some work in the community. You're doing some type of service. That's how you honor the people that have gone before you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kwame.
I see someone with a raised hand, and if I was going to guess at your name, I would say Gisela, but I'm aware I may be wrong. So please unmute yourself and go ahead, and I apologize if I just,
That's okay. It is Gisela, and I am a German. So I kind of look at my ancestors and go, oh no. But one of the things I wanted to say, though, like at my church, unfortunately, we're very white. And I've already mentioned I want them to take down all the pictures of white Jesus, because he's not blue-eyed. He wasn't blue-eyed. And I just wished we had more. I've mentioned it, that I think we should maybe have one of the black pastors come that are on the island. They're not Lutheran, but it doesn't matter, you know, and maybe just have them. In our Bible study, we're doing a thing about being the bridge too, to have conversations with one another. People don't know one another. They don't talk to one another enough. I used to live in the Virgin Islands too, so it was kind of a great experience I had there.
Yeah, I think one of the things that can also happen with, if your congregation happens to be, German, Danish, et cetera, that sort of background, and you're wanting to build relationships, I will say this. Be invited into a space where there are folks of the diaspora and other diasporas. Ask to be invited into that space to have a conversation, but you have to go and you have to do active listening first.
Mm-hmm.
You must do active listening because you have to listen to the pain, the suffering that they have experienced being in mostly white spaces.
Yeah.
And then commit to actually, even if you don't understand their anger, because there's going to be righteous rage that's going to happen. There's going to be righteous anger. I think that's one thing people do not understand, is the fact that we of the diaspora are absolutely and rightfully so angry for what is all that's happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're going to have to hear the anger, and you're going to be uncomfortable, and you're going to hear all these other things that happen. And then once there's a conversation where you actually just sit and listen to their stories, and maybe you all have to go back and think and do some reading, some education, then if they want to invite you into something further, let them invite you in first and say, we're here to help. And that's it. And let them give you direction. And know that you're going to hear the gospel from them. Whatever tradition that is, whether they're Christian or other things, you're going to hear the gospel from them.
Right.
They don't need to be taught the gospel or God's word or anything like that. That's some of the mistake. People have come into communities of color and have assumed a whole bunch of things, which is why it was very important for me to say in West African tradition, there was already a monotheistic God, but there were other things. There were other ways that God empowered what I call children of culture and of nature, of my ancestors. So I think you really have to do that. Like, it's great if you want to invite folks in, but know that it just doesn't start with just an invitation and you stop and then you say, well, we did this, we checked this off. No, like you're literally going to have to do the work, because otherwise it's all for naught. So thank you.
Yeah, I grew up in the South too.
I'd like to make a space if there's anyone in the Bethlehem community who has thoughts or questions that you would like to share with us. Now would be a wonderful time for that. And you can just unmute yourself if you would like to go.
I would just like to say thank you to Reverend Kwame. This was just a beautiful event. I'm not sure if many of you knew, but the Bethlehem family knew that my uncle's memorial was planned for tomorrow. So this was supposed to be the kickoff for his celebration tomorrow. And of course we have Delta. So his celebration will be next week. But I just want to thank you, because this is still a great kickoff, and it will leave us with a week of, thoughtfulness and actual joy that this conversation happened. I really appreciate you. It's just been wonderful. And so thank you very much.
And thank you to be able to be a part of honoring Nathaniel, who's now ancestor. So thank you for allowing all of this to happen. And we'll continue to pray for not only for your family as you mourn and remember, but also for those who are in the path of yet another expression of nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Deidre. Are there other people from Bethlehem who would like to say something?
Yes, I'd like to say something. Kwame, that was a brilliant and well thought lecture. I appreciate that. Learned a lot from it. We at Bethlehem, as you said, we enjoy, we appreciate that. It was probably our kickoff for Uncle Nat, but it, like I said, it still did its purpose. It gave us some dollars to lay people on for the next week, and wanted to say thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
I see Samara, Joycelyn, Janet, maybe. I may be missing other people's names. There's a lot, but anything y'all want to say or questions you have?
Samara here. I just want to say thank you, and I look forward to the continuation of this series for Mr. Nat.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I think we have time then to maybe take 2 more questions from the rest of the country. So if you have one, move yourself off of mute and bring it.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I was trying to, good evening to everyone. I was trying to get unmuted so I could say something. This was a blessing to have, and it was very enjoyable, and I'm very happy we are involved to continue. This is Betty, pastor, one of the pastor's members.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Betty. I have one question in the chat that Francisco asked me to read. He is apparently in a place that is even louder than your motorcycles. And so he wrote, most people don't realize that interfaith is more than just Muslims, Christians, Jews, and Buddhists. These faiths from the African diaspora are very important too. Vodun, Santeria, Quran, Candomblé, as well as indigenous peoples' faiths, Brujeria, etc. What are ways that local congregations can reach out to them in ways that are intense and real?
So I think, so I'll thank Francisco for that question. I think before we do a lot of reaching out to folks, because one of the things that is very clear is that people that are of those faith traditions are also very secretive for a number of reasons. They could lose their job, they could be harassed, maybe their family members don't know any of that. And so if there's like an interfaith like ceremony or something like that, if there's something, some prayer vigil, just having connections and letting them know that you are here. I also think that a lot of times, a lot of these spaces, sometimes they need space just to meet, to have conversation or whatever, and open up your space. Or even if people have questions about it, they know that there's this, Santeria down the street, or Botanica, if you are, most major cities has a Botanica. You've never been to Botanica, they sell candles and stuff, but it's all this weird stuff. I mean, like just that education. I think that would really be a place that people can go and start to have it. But you also have to be, I think before you approach folks, your congregation and your community have to be open to it. Now, some people aren't, and that's okay. I mean, the best thing we can do is those who identify as Christians, that you should definitely like research, read up on, and there are tons of books and stuff that are out there that you can read about and at least understand that, oh, this is a valid faith practice. If you find yourself in the spaces where you can actually engage those folks, like engage them, invite them to your church, and and talk with folks, and like have an open forum where people can come and ask them questions, and just to demystify some of the misconceptions and some of the stereotypes that have been placed about all of these traditions and all these faiths. They're real, they're just as valid. These people get up, go to work, do everything else like everybody else does. They've suffered from COVID. They're now really starting to come out more and more in protests and marches for Black Lives Matters and other things. That was the, like I said, that next to last slide was the slide that I showed you, that they had actually come out for George Floyd. There have been altars. If you haven't been to a George Floyd's murder, there have been a number of altars that have been placed, and people don't recognize this, but they actually have been placed around where he was murdered. There are people who come out and have done those rituals just for healing and for lifting him up as ancestor. I think the biggest thing that really sat with me and almost brought me to tears was that even though I did not watch that horrific video, in those last moments, he called out to his mother. It was only later that, I found out everyone had heard that, well, he's calling to his mother. His mother is ancestor. So he's calling out to his ancestor. He's calling out his mother. That's a moment when the veil lifts. And so like now he is ancestor. And so like, what do we do in his memory? So I think those are some of the things that we really have to do. I mean, if people are in major cities where you either know people in your neighborhood, have open forums, try to support some of the work that they do. They've got spiritual candles. You can go in there and pick up a candle out of there. They've got incense. There's some, some things that, yes, you can get in there, but just learning. Like, I think we have gotten so far away from learning about new things or learning about different things because we become so individualized. Like, we don't do that anymore. We don't learn. Like, learn something. I mean, I think one thing this pandemic has definitely brought us is that we have to learn more. There's so much stuff that we haven't exposed ourselves to or understood, and now we have the ability to now do that. And I know I looked at Di's posts. It's not just folks here in the West. There are other indigenous traditions from India and other places. Like, we have to respect those Hindus and others, all those other traditions. Like, these are valid and important faith traditions that we have to honor. This is how we're all still connected to God, regardless of how we call God. We're still all connected. I think that's the important thing that I would want everyone to know about. So thank you.
Well, now that I've figured out how to use my volume, I would say one more thing. I can't tell if I'm cutting anyone else off. I don't think I am. Okay. I wanted to just say that the altars around George Floyd's memorial are still so thriving. And the reason I'm on a phone right now is because I started your call when I left the square earlier and was listening to you as I drove back to where I live, more than an hour from there. And one of the things that's so beautiful there today, so really I'm just kind of sharing the story of the altar there at this moment, is that the people that tend it don't let anything be taken away. So there's all these signs of lots of traditions and lots of ancestors, and they all just sit together. And the people, they stay in that square is protected 24 hours a day, and they don't let anything be taken away. So if you come and you set something there, whether this is from your grandmother or your religious tradition or wherever, it's all going to sit beside all the rest. And then the citizens of the city are protecting it, and they will not let the police in. And yesterday a Klansman tried to come in, and they get the Klansman out without weapons. And it's just such a powerful altar of many, many traditions. And so I feel some of the power of what you're saying very much like literally growing out of the street of Minneapolis right now. In fact, they're trying to raise money to put a greenhouse around the plants so that it can stay alive through our Minnesota winter.
Thank you so much. I think one of the important things also to know is this. It doesn't matter if you are Christian or Buddhist or whatever. If you come into one of the ancient traditions, one of the indigenous traditions, you're welcome. Christianity is the only tradition that blocks everybody out. Christianity is the only one that will tell you that you have to assimilate and you have to forget everything in order to be accepted in Christianity. And we know this is not true. Jesus does not say, I want you to build a building and you can only be this, and you only can subscribe to this, and you can only do this. Nope. That's not what Jesus did. Jesus welcomed all. Jesus healed all, regardless of who they were or what their faith tradition was. Like, that literally is Jesus's work. So I think the biggest thing we can do as Christians, and those who Christians, and I mean, and I do identify, so do know that I do identify as a Christian. I have identified as a Christian for many years. I do also have this other part of my faith, my part of my spiritual journey, where I also incorporate indigenous spirituality into my life. So do realize that my household is an interfaith household. So I think the biggest thing we can do as Christians is to stop thinking that we're the end all be all. We're not. We're on this planet with everybody else. And once we begin to actually work together and stop working against one another or competing or trying to down one another, I think those who have been traumatized by the church and traumatized in other ways, like when they see Christianity actually being what we're supposed to be doing, like that's a lot of healing. That may not come in my lifetime or anybody else's lifetime or whatever, but we gotta stop domineering everything. Like, except people come in and say, well, I'm Buddhist and Christian, fine, great. There's no problem with that. Who said there was a problem? If someone says they come and they practice Santeria and Christianity, there's a saying in Haiti, in the morning, you go to the Catholic Church. In the evening, you go down and you perform ritual and you're in the place and you're practicing the ancient faith of voodoo. Like, it's a thing. Haitians are all most Haitians are all dual faith. That's just how it is. And somehow it works and they get along and they don't disrespect each other. So I think we have to stop being so domineering. We're not the end all be all. We're part of a bigger whole. And we're all loved of God. So there it is.
Thank you. I've gotten one more question in the chat, which I think would be a beautiful and important way to end. It's from Reverend Starr. And he writes, what do you want most for people of African descent in terms of reclaiming ritual?
Thank you. Thank you to Reverend Starr for that question. That it's a beautiful way to end, and something even I have to think about. I think one of the things that the ways in which we in the African diaspora can reclaim rituals, that we have to let go of the stereotype that has been taught to us all these years, and know that ritual can happen in our homes. It's okay if we venerate our ancestors in our home. It's okay if we do healing rites in our home with our family. It's okay to do all that stuff. It's all right. It's still an expression of God. But that's a long journey that we have to, and there's a lot of things that we have to unlearn. Like for many people who on this call or who have read or heard this, like it makes sense, but there are a lot of folks who are not willing to do it. There's a lot of unlearning that has to happen so that we can, and then the fact is that if we know of places or communities that do practice these faiths, just to go and just to be present and to take in that beauty and know this is another way to express our connection to Creator and to learn these things. I think it's going to take some time. It's a lot of learning. But I think it's a lot of unlearning we have to do first before we can actually reclaim rituals. But that's why ancestral veneration is about the easiest thing we can do in our homes, to set up those ancestral altars and to sit and to pray and do our devotions right there at the altar and talk to our ancestors. That's one way. Because there are a lot of rituals and a lot of other ways that maybe perhaps are uncomfortable for us, and I get that and I understand that. But just recognizing that this is a part of our spiritual and faith heritage. I think that's one way we reclaim ritual. It's accepted as something powerful for us, a way of healing. We go back to these ways of healing and of hope, and we can begin to heal ourselves from the racial trauma that's been put on us, and we can also be empowered to go out and fight for that liberation that is due us.
Thank you. I want to begin our close, first of all, by thanking Reverend Kwame. This was an extraordinary talk. I also want to thank our ancestor, Nathaniel Lawson. I want to thank Trinity in South Dakota for your amazing gift that made this, and we hope many, many more of these possible. And I really want to thank all of you for making time on a Friday night in 2020, when, hours ago you could have been in bed, in pajamas, watching Netflix or drinking, like whatever's getting you through, you could have been doing that. And you chose to make time to listen to a revolutionary pastor and theologian. And so I want to thank all of you. I don't think it's any exaggeration. I mean, it's in some sense my job to say this, but I don't think it's any exaggeration really to say this was an extraordinary night, an extraordinary evening. I think at our peak we had like 79, 80 people together from states across the country listening to a lecture designed not just to make us think, but to move us somewhere and to help us go somewhere that we had not before. I'm really, really grateful for that. I expect that this week Bethlehem's council will inform me that they have selected my urgent replacement, and I don't even feel bad about it. You know, we'll welcome you to New Orleans in person as soon as we are able. Yeah, I put in the chat a little while ago the website for Reverend Kwame's church and ministry, if you want to check that out and support it and see what she is up to.
I mean, it's not like all this revolutionary stuff. Know that most of this revolutionary stuff I'm doing on my own as a womanist practical theologian. So I do have a podcast called The Theology of a Dualistic Daughter. This is a podcast where I talk about that. I will have guests on that are talking about people who are actually in the faith, who have had this role in the faith. But if you friend me on Facebook, I will respond. And that's a lot of places where I'm doing a lot of this work. So I'm hoping to do more revolutionary work, but I am dealing with a congregation that's not too revolutionary. So, thanks to Francisco who just put the Patreon in there. But I will send the link to Ben, and Ben can put it out to you. But it's my journey of this dualistic identity, and some of the people who I've come in contact with who have taught me a lot, and who are very public with who they are. So you can definitely check that out. Other than that, yes, you're more than welcome. You can check out my church. You can check out my sermons. But sometimes we can't be revolutionary rebel, even though I try to in all places.
Yeah, thank you. I hope that you will connect with Bethlehem. Find us on Facebook, support us, figure out ways that we can collaborate and get together and make more things like this happen that benefit the whole church. And that's what I'm really excited about this, as well as our community here in New Orleans. I think all of your emails. If somehow you got the link and didn't email me, send me one. But we have recorded it, and I will send out that recording to all of you to for your own benefit, but also feel free to share it as well. I was blessed this morning to do the graveside service for another very beloved member of Bethlehem, Brenda, and I want to just acknowledge her, and I will end as I ended that service by saying, let us go in peace. Thank you.
Thanks be to God.
Amen.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Everyone be safe, healthy, and blessed.
Amen. Thank you so much. Take